graveyard here, or the churchyard. Technically it would have been at the time the building was still standing. The story of the Plum Church, as with many of the Germans from Russian congregations, actually begins in Russia. For many of those who joined Baptist and German congregational churches were influenced by the movement in Russia that was known as Stuntism. It was a revival movement that swept through South Russia and even into the Volga region in the middle 1800s. Pastor Johannes Blomkemper, and Sarah, if you pass that first picture around, I believe, in that folder that you should have picked up at the church back there is a picture of Blomkemper and his wife. That first picture there, you can start passing that around. That is the first and second pastor here. The Pastor Liebig in this picture was one of the early ministers in the Stundist movement. He spent about 30 years in Russia in this revival movement, and eventually he was forced to leave the country, as was Blomkemper. But Pastor Blomkemper was of the Reformed pastor of the parish of Rohrbach, Worms, Waterloo, and Johannesthal, I believe, and he was instrumental in starting this Stundist movement. There was a shortage of ministers in Russia. The Lutherans and the Reformed shared ministers, so Blomkemper preached in both churches and in these villages. He taught that people should spend eine Stunde, 1 hour, in Bible study and prayer, and every day preferably, and it would change your life. And the people began to do this, and they were changed. In fact, a great revival broke out, especially among the young people, that according to those who had kept diaries in those days, we would probably categorize it as a charismatic movement today. And groups of people began meeting and studying in their homes without a minister present. The people desired to live more holy lives and to give the gospel to their Russian neighbors. Now, the consistory of Odessa came to Pastor Blomkemper, and Pastor Blomkemper, if you were on last year's tour, we went to his grave. He's buried in Scotland Cemetery. But they told Pastor Blomkemper, you have to stop this nonsense. And Pastor Blomkemper said, I cannot stop what God has started. Blomkemper bought Russian Bibles by the case, and he encouraged the German people to pass them out to their neighbors. One man wrote in his diary, before the good Pastor Blomkemper came to us, we were as sheep without a shepherd. The men of the villages whiled away the hours in idleness in the taverns, leaving their women to farm. But when we were enlightened by the gospel, the message was received with gladness and industry, and thrift took the place of idleness. When Johann Blomkemper wrote in his diary about these rather charismatic home meetings, his son Carl had written, we find written in the margin of that diary, Carl had written, peasants. He was not caught up in the movement, but instead he decided that he was going to come to the United States to seek his fortune. So Carl Blomkemper came to the U.S. in 1849. He was going to seek his fortune. He was going to go and he was going to end up with the Betty group in Sandusky, Ohio, that group that had gone there earlier. And but he got caught in a storm at sea. And he thought that surely that the boat would sink, and so he dedicated his life to Christ on the boat and decided that if the Lord spared his life when he got to America, he would go to the German Reformed Seminary in Pennsylvania, which he did. And he entered into the ministry, and he pastored churches in several U.S. states, and then he was called to come back home to Worms and Rohrbach, because the good pastor Johann Blomkemper, his father, had been driven out of Russia by church authorities, and he had been sent to be a missionary in Turkey instead. Dejected and weak, Pastor Johannes Blomkemper died in 1857. Carl came home to Russia and took his father's pastorate in the villages where his father had been pastor. Now, when Catherine the Great invited the German people to come to Russia, she said, well, she gave them a wonderful deal. They all got about 180 acres of land. They didn't have to pay taxes. They didn't have to fight in the German military. They were free to conduct their villages and churches and schools in their own German language, complete freedom of religion she gave them. And a lot of them, they didn't have this when they lived back in Western Europe, and so that was the drawing card. And when they got there, there was one thing that they could not do, and that was you were not to make proselytes from the Orthodox population of South Russia, which today we would call Ukraine. Now, they were allowed to make converts, as many as they wanted, from the Muslims who lived in that neck of the woods, but you were not to make converts from the Orthodox people. Bonkemper, when he took over where his father's churches, he kind of took over where his father had left off when they ran him off. Only Karl was much more bold than his father. He not only purchased Bibles to encourage the people to continue the Stuntis movement, but he so much as dared to preach to the Ukrainians in their own language, because he was fluent in at least 5 different languages. The home meetings of the Stuntis resulted in people desiring a church that they thought was more low church, or based on the Bible and not based on creeds and rituals. Soon separate evangelical Stundist churches sprang up in the German villages of South Russia, and many of these were influenced by the German missionary Pastor Anken, who had come down from Germany when he heard about this revival movement in South Russia. And Pastor Anken began to preach the practice of believers' baptism by immersion. So a number of the Germans from Russia arrived here in the United States, in particular a number in this congregation, with Stundist ideas, and a number of others that arrived with Stundist ideas down here south of Clayton. They formed the German Congregational Church, where these up here ended up forming a German Baptist church. Many of the other converts that had come into the Baptist movement in those early days actually had been Lutherans in the old country, but when they got over here, they said that the Lutheran church was too high church, and they weren't used to that. They said that we want preaching like we had heard with the Bonekempers, and so they either joined German Congregational churches or German Baptist churches. There were other German Baptists in the area. Baptists had settled along Emmanuel Creek near Tyndall, south of Parkston, near Lake, south of Milltown, and here at Plum Creek. And there was a group that met in Menno. Pastors Reichle and Crony arrived in 1881. Pastor Crony settled on this section of land where we're standing, and the Plum Creek German Baptist Church was organized here on June 9, 1883. But there were preaching stations at Bridgewater, at Culm and Menno. By 1895, there were Germans from Russia that had Baptist congregations at Big Stone City, Tyndall, Avon, here at Plum Creek, Danzig, Dry Creek south of Milltown, Parkston, Culm, and Bridgewater, Menno, Eureka, Warner, Fairfax west of the river, and just across the state line in Naper, Nebraska. And in going through the book, the records are all kept in German. I noticed that a number of those here were converted in Russia already and had been baptized by Pastor August Liebig. And sir, if you just start passing the pictures around, the people can look at it. Pastor Liebig was a Stundist missionary. I had heard of him because he had a lot to do with the development of the Mennonite Brethren Church, and he had served a good many years in Russia before being run out of the country. In 1876, Karl Bonkemper had been run out of Russia as well, and he had come to Scotland, South Dakota, and had a homestead south of Scotland, and he pastored a number of Reformed churches in the area. And the land for the church and the cemetery here was donated by Pastor Crony, as this was his homestead, and the first burials in this cemetery are those 2 little white stones over there. They are his children. His son Jacob in 1883 and their daughter Amalia in 1888. Pastor Crony then went on to Oregon from here and pastored a German-Russian congregation in Oregon of not Black Sea Germans, but Volga Germans out there. And Pastor Liebig, the one who had worked for so many years in the Stundist movement in Russia, he came and you'll see his picture on one of these sheets. He came and became the pastor here at Plum Creek. A small church building was built here in 1883. Fred Beyer supervised, but they soon outgrew that building, and a new one was built and dedicated in 1899. And you can see that 1899 one in that one photo. The old church building that they had outgrown was sold to the Seventh-day Adventists, who were 2 miles west here, right across the kitty corner across from Wesley Cheddar's place. And there is a graveyard there, and Wesley has done a nice job of fixing that up in the last few years. It's known as the Westford Seventh-day Adventist Church. All of the members of that Westford Church came out of the Plum Creek Baptist Church. In going through the book, it was interesting to note, in those early years when these pioneers were struggling, at least 20 of the members of this congregation went down the road and formed that Westford Seventh-day Adventist Church. It states in the church book that those people were ausgeschlossen, that they were locked out, which we would say excluded. And yet in 1899, this congregation had grown to be so large that they had to build a new church. In 1899, which you see in the photos, that church was here, and in the 1920s, they built a basement under the church. John Heitzman, in his memoirs, wrote that a visiting pastor from Milwaukee came to raise funds to build a new church in Milwaukee, and upon observing Sunday school in the Plum Creek Church, with the little girls on one side of the minister's platform and the little boys on the other side learning their German ABCs, the women's class on the ladies' side of the church, on the south side of the church, and the men's class on the north side of the church, when he got up to speak, the pastor said it reminded him of a Judenschule, a Jewish school. Well, he won no points with the congregation here at Plum Creek, and the pastor left without much of a collection. But the people here at Plum Creek said, why should we raise money to build big fancy churches in a city when we meet like this? So they decided that they would use their money to build a basement under the entire church, and then they would have room for Sunday school. There's a Mrs. Schmidtke who's buried over here, and I say that every story has its cemetery has its story of tragedy, and there truly were a number of tragedies in that Schmidtke family. But I'll save that for another time. In 1902, a number of Baptists went to North Dakota. They had followed the Adventists up there because land was available. They established Baptist churches up there, and Hutchinson County's Adventists all ended up leaving and started several churches there in North Dakota. Over the years, some from this congregation moved to Lodi, California. John Heitzman tells of the early days that the church was divided into several groups for the purpose of maintenance of the building. In one group, on church cleaning day, one of the mothers was sick, had a sick child, and had to stay home. But her husband came along to work at the church. He stopped to pick up a neighbor lady whom he made sit in the back of the wagon. After all, at church, the sexes had to remain separate, and he didn't want anyone accusing him of impropriety. The records were kept in German until 1949, when the transition began between German and English in the services, and so beginning in 1950, the records are all in English. In those old German records, you find some very interesting items that were discussed. In 1906, the WMU was started, the Women's Missionary Union. We'd call it Ladies' Aid. The Jugendverein, Young People's Association, was also started. And there was considerable opposition, it noted, by the older members of the church. So when the young people's group was organized, it was organized that the young men and the young women must meet separately. But by the 20s, they had decided to get together, and they had formed quite a choir here at Plum Creek. And you'll see that one photo of the choir in the 1920s. In 1916, 1917, a number of the members moved to Wessington Springs because land was cheap up there, and they started the German Baptist Church in Wessington Springs. One young man in the church, whom we will call Jacob, though that wasn't his real name, He had moved to Wessington Springs in 1916. This young man was sent with a horse and buggy to go to Alpena and pick up the new minister for Wessington Springs from the Alpena train depot. Well, he couldn't find the minister when he got to Alpena, but he did find the saloon. Before Jake returned home the next morning, the minister did appear, and he found him there in Alpena, and Jake was still tying it on and was in a rather jolly mood, it is reported, as they went back to Springs. Stopping at the farms of all the Baptists that lived along the way, Jacob loudly proclaimed and announced that he had brought the new preacher with him. Well, news of this got back to Plum Creek, where the man's membership was still here in this church, and he was locked out for public intoxication. The man, when he found out that he had been excommunicated, put up quite a fuss from afar. But under protest, the Plum Creek Church said that they would therefore grant him a letter of transfer to the Wessington Springs congregation only if they had found out from Wessington Springs that he had stood in church and confessed with a plea for forgiveness. Another incident was mentioned where a young man was disciplined with the same sentence for having stood on a float in a parade in Emory, and the float was the float of a local saloon. Another interesting one is during a celebration in town. It didn't state whether it was Emory, Bridgewater, or Alec, but one of the church members had allowed his young daughter to have a ride on a merry-go-round. Since the young girl was already a baptized member of the church, she was admonished in church for her worldly behavior. The church was enlarged again in 1949. You see some interesting pictures there of the church in 49. If you see, they wanted to get a picture of the back of the church before they added on. And so they stood over there where you see that heather tombstone. If you go over there with that black and white photo, you can stand in that spot and look over and imagine how the church was there. But it was enlarged in 1949 and was again enlarged in 1967. When the congregation was at its height of membership of about 150 baptized members and running near 200 in attendance. This congregation produced several ministers and foreign missionaries, and a number of missionaries' wives, including the pastor's wife that was my pastor when I was a boy growing up. In the early years, they maintained a parsonage in Bridgewater, which was sold when the church in Bridgewater was closed. And the members of the Bridgewater congregation were divided amongst Emory, Spring Valley, and Madison. There is a list there that I have of all the, Sarah, if you come here and pick it up and pass them out. If somebody wants to keep them, they're more than happy to. They're underneath my clipboard. As soon as I let go, they're going to blow away. Got them? If you pass these out, somebody wants to keep them, there is a plat of this area of Hutchinson County and another plat of the lower area in Hanson County that shows the farms of the original homesteaders, and you can see these are the names in many of these early graves here in this cemetery. There's also a list there of the huge number of people that were the charter members of this congregation. Now you have to remember this. The congregation actually consisted of 3 preaching points. And I tried to make note of that, as was in the record of the names in Menno and the names that were at Bridgewater. But when the Bridgewater church closed, some of them went to Emory, others went to the Spring Valley German Baptist Church, which was south of Canastota, and still other members went to the German Baptist Church in Madison. In the latter years, this church was served along with the United Brethren in Christ Church in Milltown by student pastors from the North American Baptist Seminary in Sioux Falls. Families moved away. Families got smaller, but farms got larger. Many younger families joined the First Baptist Church in Emory since their kids were attending school there. And so in 1997, the church decided to close. Some at the closing went to church in Emory. Others joined churches in Freeman. The building and contents were sold at auction. This cemetery remains as an active cemetery with burials still held here, and much of the maintenance and care here is thanks to Mr. Larry God bless you. You've done a great job here. And he lives up here, if you don't know Larry, on a farm just south of Emory. So that concludes my speech here. You can take a little time and look around. If you want one of these pages, please help yourself. And then we will venture down to the Wolf Creek Church.